By early 2026, nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran had stalled completely. In response, Washington initiated a massive military mobilization across the Middle East, moving naval assets like the USS Abraham Lincoln into striking distance. Then, on February 28th, the strategy shifted from deterrence to direct action. American and Israeli forces launched a massive coordinated aerial assault deep into Iranian territory. The operation instantly disabled military installations and nuclear sites and plunged the country into a near-total internet blackout. The strikes also killed top Iranian officials, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Washington and Jerusalem justified the attack as a necessary preemptive measure against an imminent nuclear threat. The United States government explicitly stated their goal was to trigger a regime change in Tehran. The sheer scale of these strikes ended the possibility of a contained, localized conflict. A vacuum had been created, and it threatened to pull the entire globe into the fallout. In the hours following the strikes, the public braced for a binary global war, the U.S. and its allies versus Iran and its partners. That traditional divide never materialized. Rather than rushing to join the battle lines, neighboring states and rival superpowers spent the opening days maneuvering to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. In a globalized economy, ideological loyalties are a secondary concern. When the missiles began to fly, neighboring nations prioritized their own economic survival. Lacking conventional air superiority, Iran retaliated with Operation True Promise 4, launching coordinated swarms of drones and ballistic missiles. But these strikes introduced a serious geographic complication. Iran didn't solely target Israel. They aimed their projectiles at American military bases hosted inside Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. This forced those Arab nations into a severe diplomatic dilemma. Their sovereign airspace and physical infrastructure were actively under attack, requiring a military response. Yet they categorically refused to officially join the US-led offensive against Tehran. To thread this needle, Jordan and Saudi Arabia turned to international law. They invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, framing their choice to shoot down Iranian projectiles strictly as a mandated right to self-defense. To further distance themselves from Washington, these exact same Arab states loudly condemned concurrent Israeli military actions in Lebanon and Gaza, broadcasting to the world that they were not aligned with the Western campaign. By leaning heavily on UN mandates, regional leaders managed to protect their sovereign borders and citizens without being classified as active belligerents in the conflict. As the conflict intensified and Iran's economy buckled under the bombardment, many Western analysts assumed Beijing would intervene militarily to save its strategic partner. That didn't happen. Instead, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi issued sharp rhetorical condemnations, calling the American strikes an illegal violation of sovereignty, while pointedly refusing to mobilize a single ship or soldier. This illustrates China's specific geopolitical model. They operate as partners, not allies. Beijing prioritizes deep economic engagement and technological cooperation over strict binding security agreements. Unlike the American system of mutual defense treaties, China deliberately avoids high-risk obligations that would force its military into a Middle Eastern proxy war. Beijing views externally driven regime change as a dangerous precedent. However, they are entirely unwilling to sacrifice their own national stability to fight another country's battles. China is the world's largest importer of oil. Beijing's diplomatic criticisms of the strikes were sharp, but its practical response was driven by the necessity of industrial survival. This illustrates a massive vulnerability for Beijing. It tracks the volume of maritime oil flowing directly from the Strait of Hormuz to Chinese ports. When Iran retaliated by closing that critical checkpoint, it threatened to starve China of energy and crash its domestic economy. We can see here that overland energy exports from Russia are already operating at their maximum limits. There is simply no alternative physical supply capable of replacing the millions of barrels blocked in the Gulf. Because Iran remains heavily dependent on Chinese revenue, Beijing leveraged its unique position as a buyer of last resort, stepping in as a diplomatic intermediary between the warring factions to negotiate a reopening of the trade routes. For the Chinese government, unblocking the Strait of Hormuz to secure its own economic survival took absolute precedence over ensuring the political survival of the Iranian regime. Weeks into the conflict, the Middle East faced hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure damage, thousands of casualties, and heavily strained fragile ceasefires. The fallout rippled outward instantly. The fighting triggered the largest global oil supply disruption since the energy crises of the 1970s, sending a wave of volatility through international financial markets. The conflict in Iran demonstrated that the era of binary us versus them proxy wars has ended. Global supply chains are now so deeply integrated that total war is simply too expensive and destructive for the world's superpowers to tolerate. The ultimate geopolitical deterrent has shifted. A closed trade route now exerts more pressure on global powers than a nuclear arsenal, and the 2026 war proved the lengths nations will go to reopen those channels.